Thank you for listening to Scandinavian Crimes Podcast. Be sure to check out the episode links and be part of our other social media platforms where you can leave a topic suggestion or even share some of your insights regarding the subject matter of the episode. We will always do our best to provide a well-researched episode, but sometimes due to limited access to information and translation issues, some information can be lost. It is therefore good to do your own research and get a deeper understanding of a case of your own interest. So with that all said, let us start today's episode.
Welcome to Scandinavian Crimes. My name is Devante, and say hello to my lovely co-host Delila.
Hello, everyone.
And on this podcast, we will cover famous Scandinavian criminals who made their mark throughout Scandinavian history. So today, we're going to be covering the story of Sture Ragnar Bergwall, born April 26, 1950, but notoriously and famously known as Thomas Quick. Basically, he is someone from Sweden who many previously believed he had been like a serial killer, having confessed to more than 30 murders while incarcerated in a mental institution for personality disorders. Quick was convicted of 8 murders. However, he withdrew all of his confessions in 2008, as a result of which his murder convictions were squashed and released from the hospital. This episode would raise awareness about how murder convictions could have been previously obtained on such weak evidence in various forms of criminal justice systems across the world, and has been called the largest miscarriage of justice in Swedish history. So today, we are covering the story of Thomas Quick. Thomas Quick grew up in Korsnäs with 6 siblings. He adopted his mother's maiden name, Quick, around 1991. After a history of delinquency, molestation of boys, and stabbing a man, Quick was sentenced in 1991 for armed robbery. After the robbery conviction, Quick was confined to care in an institution for the criminally insane. During therapy, he confessed to more than 30 murders committed in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland between 1964 and 1993. The therapy sessions were followed by police interviews. One of his confessions led to the solving of an 18-year-old murder considering to be an unsolvable case, and another to the informal solving of a murder in Växjö in 1964. This 1964 crime was outside the then 25-year statute of limitations in Sweden, but without information given by Quick, the case was considered closed. With no eyewitnesses or technical forensics evidence to connect him to the crimes, Quick was convicted solely on the basis of his own confessions while undergoing recovered memory therapy on, I'm going to butcher this, benzodiazepines, following by police interrogations. Details in the confessions were wildly wrong, and Quick relied on hints and body language from his interrogators to guess the answers expected of him. Quick had been researching unsolved murders on microfilm in the Royal Library, Stockholm, when he was released, and confessing to a murder in Norway led to a Norwegian newspaper writing his story. Quick requested back copies including early reports of the story from Norwegian journalists and could include details unknown to Swedish police, and they concluded that only the perpetrator knew. 9-year-old Teresa Johannesson had disappeared from Fjäll in 1988 and had not been found since. 10 years later, Quick was convicted of murdering her. The crucial evidence was the discovery of a burnt bone fragments from what should have been a child. In 2012, laboratory tests showed that the supposed bone fragments were composed of wood and glue fused together, probably hardboard. An analysis had not been performed before the evidence was presented to the court. Examination of his answers showed that his initial attempts to provide answers to questions concerning, for example, murder weapons and birthmarks were wrong. Leading questions were asked in police interviews, and initial erroneous guesses were edited out of the version presented to the court. The involvement of the therapist meant that Quick's early failure to provide anything more than a vague, confused, and facilitating picture that gradually sharpened in focus was explained away as a result of repressed memories being retrieved as a result of the therapy. In the judgment of the case of Teresa, one can read that the psychologist Christensen told the court, traumatic events are retained in the memory, but there can be protective mechanisms that work in unconscious to repress the recall. Similar arguments about Quick's repressed memories reoccur again and again in the judgments. The credibility of Quick's confession was widely debated in Swedish media. Critics of these confessions and trials included a policeman involved in one of the investigations, wrote that there was no evidence that tied Quick to any of the murders he had confessed, and until he had showed something that he had taken belonged to one of the victims, the probability was that he was a compulsive liar. In December 2008, television interview with Hans Rostam, Quick denied taking part either in any of the murders for which he had been sentenced or in the more than 30 murders he had confessed to. Because the only evidence to support the convictions were his own confessions, which he now had retracted, and nothing else remained on which to base of judgments, Sture Bergwall, Quick, changed his lawyer, and the 8 murder convictions handed down. The 6 trials were all squashed on appeal. The last one was squashed in July 2013. Thomas Quick, who now reverted to his birth name, Sture Bergwall, was set at liberty after having been confined for more than 20 years in an institution for the criminally insane, with conditions that he refrains from alcohol and narcotics. Between 1994 and 2001, Quick was convicted of 8 murders. In Sweden, a defendant also gains access to the full police investigation prior to the trial. Quick's lawyer, Claes Borgström, has been criticized for failing to protect his mentally disturbed client's objective interest in being judged not guilty. In the years following 1990, when Quick was sentenced to closed psychiatric confinement, he confessed to several well-publicized unsolved murders. His first murder, according to his own accounts, occurred in Växjö in 1964 when Quick was only 14 years old. The victim, Thomas Blogren, was described by Quick as being the same age but not as strong and tall as himself. At the time of his confession, the murder was already subject to the statute of limitations, which Quick later admitted was the reason for confessing, but later it transpired that Quick had a watertight alibi. On the day of the murder, he was attending his own confirmation with his family at the Pentecostal church. The second alleged victim was Alvar Larsson, whom Quick claimed to have murdered at Sörkön at the Lake Asnen outside of the town of Urshult. According to Quick's sister, Quick never left Falun at the time of the murder. The credibility of Quick's confession had been widely debated in the Swedish media since 1993 up until 2008, when Quick withdrew his confessions. There have been consistent doubts about the reliability of his statements, in which some of his confessions have been proven to be fabrications. The 2 African refugees Quick confessed to murdering in Norway were found to be alive and very well. A DNA sample from the crime in Norway was subsequently found to be a mismatch, and there was no technical forensic evidence to link Quick to any of these crimes. Another dubious circumstance is the fact that no witness have ever testified to seeing Quick in proximity of any of the crime scenes, even though more than 10,000 people were interviewed for the intricate details. Critics of these confessions and the trials claim that Quick never murdered anyone, but that he was a compulsive liar. Among the critics are the parents of the child he confessed to having murdered in the late 1970s. In response to these accusations, Quick himself wrote an article for the Swedish newspaper Dagens Nyheter in 2001, in which he said that he refused to cooperate further with the authorities concerning all open murder investigations. In November 2006, Thomas Quick's trials were reported to be the Swedish Chancellor of Justice by retired lawyer Pelle Svensson, on behalf of the parents of the murder victim who wished to have the trials declared invalid. Several principals in the fields of law and psychiatry, among them Swedish criminologist and television crime commentator Leif G.W. Persson, and 2 police officers involved in the investigation of the murders who refused to involve themselves further in the investigation, all claim that Quick has a history of mental illness, but it was unlikely he was guilty of any crimes to which he had confessed. The handling of the Quick case has been described as a most scandalous chapter of Scandinavian history, branding it as glaring incompetence, naivete, and opportunism within the police and judicial system. Quick withdrew all his confessions in 2008 during the recording of a TV documentary made by prize-winning investigative journalist Hans, who died shortly before his book version was published. Quick's attorney contended on the prosecution withheld important investigative material from the defense, which the prosecution adamantly denied. Quick's attorney claimed that his client was mentally ill and was being given prescription drugs when he confessed to the killings. These arguments were some of the grounds for squashing all 8 murder convictions in 6 trials and 6 appeals. Thomas Quick, now having reverted to his birth name, Sture Bergwall, recanted his confessions and requested that Svea Court of Appeal ordered a new trial. In 2009, the Court of Appeal granted the retrial of the Yanan Levy case, In judgment, the courts found that the lower court had heard Quick correctly identify the murder weapon. However, the information had been withheld from the court that initially Quick had made many erroneous attempts to identify the murder weapon before finally giving an account that corresponded with police findings. Quick moved for a judgment of acquittal and was acquitted in September 2010. Quick's counsel also declared that his intentions to ask for a retrial of the Teresa Johannesson case, claiming that Quick had an alibi for the day when Teresa Johannesson was abducted and murdered. SKL found in March 2010 that 2 exhibits claimed by the prosecution to be bone fragments were in fact pieces of hardboard. A retrial was granted and Quick was formally acquitted when the prosecution dropped the charges. July 30th, 2013, Quick was officially acquitted of all of his murder convictions. Sture Bergwall, Thomas Quick, has been released from Satter's Institution for Criminally Insane, and most of his treatment plan has been made confidential and subject to secrecy. However, from the uncensored portions released to the press, it is apparent that Bergwall, aka Thomas Quick, has not taken medication for several years and is assessed as not requiring any.
So this story was very all over the place, so I just wanted you to clarify some things, because it seems like he did something in the 90s and then he was put in a mental hospital, or he already was in a mental hospital, and then he confessed crimes he did in the between 60s to 90s. And then he was everything seems so all over the place, and I'm unsure of what is true and what is not true basically, because critics said that he was a pathological liar, and then he was drugged, but they found evidence based on what he said, but he was also interested in unsolvable crimes or cold cases and stuff. So it's hard for me to follow through all of this. So can you please, clarify things? Give me a mind map of when everything happened, because it's very all over the place right now for me.
So basically, this is a condensed version of what happened. Essentially, they were trying to use different points in time to, validate their point that he could or couldn't have done the crime from both ends of prosecution and defense. So he did commit a crime in the 90s when he was about, 14, 15, where he had molestation tendencies, and he also had killed a man when he was a teenager, and he already had served his time for that. The confusion starts mostly because of the fact that when he actually started to, tell the police of what was going on, they had coerced him into actually telling them the answers that they wanted to hear. So a lot of people did not really, either believe him or they did believe him in saying that why would he confess to something that he did. And most of this did come about when he was in the psychiatric institution, where basically he was kind of, going through the motions of getting himself or getting to a better version of himself. And unfortunately, what can happen sometimes is people tend to, a part of that process, especially if they're having not necessarily a psychotic break, but maybe a dissociative kind of moment, they can confess to things without knowing. So that's what led to him getting confrontational with the police themselves or getting into the interrogation. But the thing that, we talked about already is the fact that he didn't know much of the details. They were guiding him towards the details. They were trying to explain to him the answer that they wanted in order to get a confession. So they kind of took advantage of his mental state and kind of used him as a scapegoat in order for people to, say oh, he did these crimes, he must have done it. And they just used him as a method of saying oh, they solved it, when in reality it wasn't him. He was just someone who lied about it because of his mental state. And some people were also using it to discredit him as well, saying he's a pathological liar, some of the specialists. So that's what they were doing throughout this whole story. Just a lot of back and forth of trying to discredit whether or not he did or did not do it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They found nothing on him, but he somehow, I feel like the experts said that he he had a therapist too who said something about him avoiding traumatic events by, like, he's having a memory loss and kind of like trying to fill in the blanks, hence why he's seen as a pathological liar with other critiques and psychiatrists and stuff. But it's like he did find the weapons, but then he said that the interview excluded that he tried many times to guess what the weapon and stuff were. And it's interesting. It's like, I don't know what is true or not. And that's why I felt it was very unfair in the beginning, where they said that, he need to go to the mental hospital and stuff. But because he had hard time with like memory loss and traumatic events, and I'm like, but he caused these traumatic events. Why is he having issues with it? But now, when I'm like trying to understand everything, it's like, okay, maybe he lied and just tried to puzzle everything together because he didn't have any memory of it. Or is that why? Or because, like...
Remember, he didn't lie. It was just the fact that he was in a vulnerable mental state, and the police had guided his confession to what they wanted, because they did not, they didn't, I guess, want to investigate any further. So basically, he was almost forced to give an answer that he wanted, or that the police wanted, in order for him to be able to, even move on from the interrogation process.
And they also excluded stuff. They excluded parts of the interview. And also back in the days, they didn't have any good kind of, what's it called? The evidence-based techniques and stuff. I don't know the fancy materials, but like they didn't have that back in the days. And that's why when they had that now in the 2000s, they were able to do all the testings, and they found out that most of the things that he confessed to was not tied to him. They also found alibi. What I thought was interesting is why he decided to all of a sudden deny all of this. Was it because he was treated and became better with his mental state, that he was able to realize that this is not what I did at all? And
yeah, so even though he got better with his mental state, that's when he started to piece together that he was taken advantage of by prosecution and the police, because there was just so much going on during that time, and he was not very well mentally, and he had no recollection of the events. He didn't have any details regarding what happened. He didn't have there was no proof or evidence that he did anything, but they just assumed, he did it because he had confessed. And at least the logic back in the day was you wouldn't confess to a crime that you didn't do, which is not true. Back in those days, a lot of police forces around the world had very, 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 very shady tactics when it came to the way that they interrogated people. They would interrogate people for hours and hours and hours, and they would get tired. So they would do that. And then ultimately, when you get exhausted from the interrogation process, they would, get you nice and weak mentally and hungry, you're starving, you're thirsty, and at some point they will just, you will basically confess to a crime that you didn't commit, even though there was absolutely no evidence of you doing that crime, because it was just an easier route for them compared to them actually investigating and doing their job at the time. And this wasn't just something that happened in Sweden, it happened in the US as well. The criteria for evidence has substantially increased in the criminal justice system. Currently, don't get me wrong, it's not perfect either, because there are some cases where this still happens. But nonetheless, at that time, they didn't have evidence on him that he had done something. And the criteria for conviction was so low back then.
Yeah, they had zero evidence, but they did find details and stuff that was only available to the police. However, he was very good in seeing their body language, how they were, the police, the investigators. He was able to answer in a way that they wanted. And also, it's so hard for me to, because I was not there, but it's still like, I know that the police and the investigators knew how to direct him into a way that they wanted him to answer, and he also followed through with that. But I think it's also like, can it be a coincidence that there was some that actually was involved? Like there was some of the cases that was found that he was guilty in. Because there was like this one, what was it? Like where his first one in Växjö, but then he had an alibi, right? Because he went to church. And the other alibi was his sister, but like the sister one, isn't that like a close relative and she can lie? Isn't that also normal? I'm just like trying to see other possibilities as well. That's why I found this so tricky in a way. Because it's sad that we don't really know what he really had either, or what kind of, like, we only know that he had memory loss because of traumatic events, but we don't really know what other diagnosis or such he had. But it took him years for him to be able to deny all the charges, right? Or all his crimes.
Yeah, basically it took a little while because he had to go through the process of doing appeals for a few cases, like I think one at a time, but I think you can, appeal cases concurrently, but essentially it did take him a little while for him to basically kind of go through each court case and actually appeal them each and then prove that he was innocent and that in some cases he had alibis. But yeah, I found this case really important, especially because we're trying to put out awareness out there, because situations like this does still happen. Like I said, it's not as common, but unfortunately we tend to see situations like this in the criminal justice system, primarily against people of color. So it can be black, even in some cases Asians or Middle Eastern, or whatever your ethnic background, if you're usually not typically white passing. In a lot of cases this does still happen, where the criteria for evidence is so much weaker because of court bias, and they will overlook a lot of stuff, including motivation, including evidence, just because the cops were able to force or basically use the high anxiety situation to their advantage and get a confession out of you. So like I said, it doesn't happen as often, but this does still happen. But back in the day, during this time when Thomas Quick was going through this process, this was an extremely common practice for a lot of police officers across the world to coerce a lot of people into committing, basically confessing to crimes. And there were a lot of people who were actually innocent, and that's, at least in the US as well, that's why we have the Innocence Project, where a lot of people who were involved in very shady investigative tactics, they get evidence, they find out that they didn't do it, and they get freed. And it's really unfortunate that stuff like this had to happen anyway, in that people wouldn't want to investigate and figure out who really did it, because if you have the wrong person in jail, then that means the person who really committed that crime is still out there, and they're more likely to commit it again because they didn't get caught. So that's why this particular one is super duper important for a lot of people out there.
You can not only based on confessions, you need other proof to further judge someone accurately. And I think it's good that other experts also criticized this case, and that he also got released from all of them, or were able to be freed from the other 8 cases that he admitted.
So after saying all that and hearing all that, please let us know what you think about this case and our social medias. You can hit us up on TikTok, Instagram, different platforms on Facebook as well. And just communicate with us what you think about cases like this, where, this is a serious miscarriage of justice, especially in Swedish history. And this particular case was not really blown up to the level that it was until relatively recently. When I say relatively recently, I mean within my lifetime. I'm not even 30 yet. So when this happened, when this was gaining traction around 2008, I was, that's like around, at least in the US, middle school, high school. So, and I'm referring to my age. So that's not that long ago. That's something that people can look back and actually remember, and, recall. So this is something that was within this generation. And, obviously the law and law enforcement and the criminal justice system across the world is constantly evolving, and we're, trying to strive for a better process for everybody. At least I would surely hope so. But yeah, let us know what you think about stuff like this. And Delila, is there anything that you want to say regarding any food or anything like that to wrap up the episode?
Yes, I have one. I would like for an egg omelet with spinach and feta cheese. Feta cheese? Sorry, I said that weirdly. Feta cheese. And like a toasted bread or two, because I like food. And yeah, and also spices, of course. Yeah.
I'm so dead. But me personally, I can go for some ribs right now. Some nice barbecue ribs. Actually, I think I can go for a nice burger right now too, to be honest with you.
Ooh.
Yeah, sounds good, right? But yeah, let us know what you think, and we will see you guys next week, right? Next week. So peace out, everyone. Bye.
Bye.